Tony asks, do you, like David the psalmist, hold to that you were conceived in sin? You're also guilty from birth. Notice that it's a prophet's own terms, leaving out the loaded terms. Well, there's some debate on how you would interpret those passages from David. Some even talk about being conceived in sin might be referencing his mother's sin, not his own, in the way he was conceived and the way oftentimes that was looked.
No, that's incorrect on all accounts, Leighton. Bastards were left out of the public life of Israel. Deuteronomy 23 verse 2 reads, "No one of illegitimate birth may enter the assembly of the Lord, none of his descendants, even to the 10th generation, may enter unto the assembly of the Lord." To enter the assembly of the Lord means either admission to public honors and offices in the church and the state of Israel, or in the case of foreigners, incorporation with that nation by marriage. It is simply a fact that no person born out of wedlock, i.e. what this interpretation suggests, could be king of Israel. So I think this interpretation fails. Furthermore, why would David bring up the sin of someone else, his mother, in the case of this interpretation, when the entire psalm is about his own personal sinfulness?
It's reference to youth or infancy. From my infancy, I have done this, or from my youth, I have done this. These are oftentimes poetic words and not necessarily talking about literally from the womb that this is happening, but at a very young age, this is when I begin to do this or begin to do that, those kinds of things.
Ah, yes, because nowhere else does David talk about his innermost parts being woven together in his mother's womb. Wait a moment.
And I do not believe that we are guilty because of what Adam did. I don't believe that the scriptures support that.
Romans 5:19, "For as through the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one the many will be made righteous." Notice the parallel. We all understand the second clause's "made righteous" to be referring to imputation. There would be an incongruity if we insisted that the first clause wasn't referencing the same theological concept. For as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners. Those in Adam imputationally were made sinners. Just as we use the theological phrase imputed righteousness, so too we use the phrase imputed guilt to describe this concept. As one of my favorite commentators points out, suppose we disturb the parallel as now adjusted and argue that Adam was not a federal head, and that we are therefore neither held guilty of Adam's sin, nor condemned and punished on account of it. Where shall we find the counterpart of this in Christ? Must we also maintain that he does not represent his people, and that they are neither esteemed righteous on account of his work, nor justified and saved by it? Such is the legitimate consequence of the opposite views. If we hold that from Adam we receive only a corrupt nature, in consequence of which we only sin personally, and then become guilty, and are in consequence condemned, we must also argue that we received from Christ only a pure renewed nature, in consequence of which we become personally righteous, and there are justified before God and saved. But such a scheme would ultimately undermine the whole gospel. Notice here the consequence of accepting Leighton's offered interpretation of these passages as he has described elsewhere. It simply brings us back to a gospel which is ultimately the gospel of Rome. Truly, the Pelagian insistence that guilt finds its ground solely in the personal voluntary sin of individuals of a race cannot be harmonized with the sustained witness of the Apostle Paul. If God only condemns and penalizes people for their own personal sin and guilt, then how can Adam's posterity justly be cursed with a sinful nature unless they are guilty by this imputation? To quote Tom Hicks of Founders, which I know Leighton loves, "Why would God curse all of Adam's race, causing them to inherit a sinful nature, if all of Adam's race is originally innocent and therefore not liable to any curse or penalty? If Adam's posterity is not in some way guilty for Adam's first sin, then it would seem most unjust for God to curse the whole race with a sinful nature on the basis of Adam's first sin." I mean, think about it. If we're not imputationally speaking guilty, what is the middle ground between guilty and innocent in God's sight? Furthermore, a rejection of imputed guilt and this weird interpretation of David that Leighton puts forward is not actually or historically true. Not all die because they actually involuntarily sin. Infants die, right? It's a sad thing of our world, but they have not actually transgressed against, and after the similitude of Adam's transgressions. Yet, Leighton believes this guilt isn't applied to them until they voluntarily sin. How does that make any sense? Those are just some things to ponder, and I don't know if the camera will pick it up. This work here, The Imputation of Adam's Sin by John Murray. It's really excellent on this topic. Death in Adam and Life in Christ by J.V. Fesco. He covers just a wide variety of imputational theology. And then finally, Chris here, the Tale of Two Adams. Just a really good Reformed exposition of this teaching, which is really central to Protestant hermeneutics. Anyways, thank you.